They found him 3 days after the evacuation order, sitting on the porch of a cabin he did not own, watching the valley below fill with light the color of a wound. The soldiers came up the ridge path in a loose column, rifles slung, not expecting trouble, just a sweep. The kind of thing you did after the first wave, after the ships had passed overhead, and the cities had gone quiet in that particular way that had nothing to do with peace. The sergeant at the front of the column was a woman named Okafor, broad shoulders, a face that had been beaten into expressionlessness by 3 weeks of what the brass were still calling a containment scenario. And when she saw the figure on the porch, she slowed, raised a fist, stopped the column. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. He had a tin cup of something hot balanced on his knee. Steam rose from it in the cold morning air. He did not appear to be in any particular hurry to go anywhere. "Civilians," she called. "This area is under mandatory evacuation. You need to come with us." He lifted the cup, drank from it slowly, set it back on his knee. "My name is Annam," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." Okafor had dealt with a lot of things in 3 weeks. She had dealt with the first contact feeds going dead mid-transmission. She had dealt with the bridge at Callaway, where something had simply dissolved the structural steel from the inside out, as if the metal itself had decided to stop being metal. She had dealt with a Marine corporal named Dressler, who'd walked into the perimeter of a downed probe at kilometer marker 42, and come back 3 days later, speaking a language that phonetically resembled nothing in the database, and weeping without any visible reason. She was, in short, not easily rattled. She was rattled now. "Sir," she said carefully, "I need you to stand up slowly, and there's one of them," Annam said, "in the ravine below the second tree line, about 600 meters down slope. It's been there since last night." He paused. "I don't think it means to leave." Okafor looked at her point man. Her point man looked at the tree line. Her point man's name was Vasquez, and he was 19 years old and had the particular stillness of a person who had recently accepted that he was probably going to die and had found the acceptance oddly liberating. "How long have you been here?" Okafor asked. 4 weeks, Annam said. "I came up before all this started." He turned the cup in his hands. "Bad memories. You know how it is." She did know how it was. She did not say so. "And the entity in the ravine. You've been observing it? We've been watching each other," he said. "It's different. They're all different, I think, but this one is." He stopped, considered. "Patient," he finished. "It's very patient." This was not in any briefing Okafor had received. Every contact report she'd seen described the entities as aggressive, territorial, their behavior patterns consistent with apex predators, establishing dominance. She had 12 dead in her unit, and that number was not an abstraction to her. It had faces and names and a smell she could not get out of her uniform. "Come down with us," she said. "You can tell the analysts." "I'll tell you," he said. "Sit down." Sergeant First Class Miriam Okafor, decorated veteran of 2 separate theaters, did not sit down when civilians told her to sit down. She sat down. She pulled her radio and told the column to hold position. And she sat on the porch steps below this stranger and she listened. His name was Annam Diallo. He was 26 years old. He had been a graduate student in xenobiological systems theory, a field that had been largely theoretical until approximately 3 weeks ago, and he had come to his uncle's hunting cabin on the eastern ridge of the Cascades because his mother had died, and he had needed to be somewhere that wasn't the apartment where she had died and the city that had been saturated with the fact of her dying. He had been there, alone and largely without satellite coverage, when the sky had done what the sky had done. He had not run. He explained this without apparent embarrassment, the way a person explains a decision that was made below the level of conscious thought. He had stood in the yard behind the cabin and watched the objects move through the upper atmosphere and felt something that was not calm exactly but was adjacent to it. He had always been better with things that were unknown than with things that were known and lost. The unknown had edges you could work with. Lost just went all the way down. The entity had arrived on the second night. He described it carefully, the way a scientist describes, with attention to what he was actually observing rather than what he expected to observe. It was roughly 2 meters tall in the configuration it most commonly held, though the term held implied a deliberateness that may or may not have been accurate. Its surface was not a surface in any conventional sense. It had multiple limbs or structures that served limb-adjacent functions. Its coloration shifted through a range that peaked in frequencies slightly beyond violet, which meant it appeared dark to him most of the time, outlined in something that wasn't quite light. It had not attacked him. It had stood at the tree line and looked at him. He had stood in the yard and looked back. This had continued intermittently for 4 weeks. Okafor stared at the middle distance while he talked. She was doing math in her head, not the useful kind, but the kind that happens when the numbers refuse to stay numbers. 12 dead. Contact reports from 47 locations, none of them describing anything like what this man was describing. The things she'd seen, the things she'd lost people to, had been fast and absolute. You didn't have time to look at them. You barely had time to understand what had happened before it was over. "Why?" she said, when he paused. "Why do you think it hasn't?" "I don't know," he said. "I've been trying to figure that out." He set the cup down on the porch railing and pulled his knees up. He was wearing work boots and jeans and a flannel shirt over a thermal layer, and he had the look of someone who had lost weight recently, but not from the circumstances you'd expect. "I think maybe it was curious about me, and I was curious about it, and that was enough to start." He looked at her. "Do you want to see it?" "You're going to introduce me," Okafor said flatly, "to one of the things that killed 12 of my people. I'm going to show it to you," he said. "You don't get introduced to something like that. You just exist near it, and it exists near you, and you see what happens." She should have said no. Every protocol said no. Every instinct built through years of training in combat said no. She said yes. The ravine was deep and cool, shaded by second-growth fir and the remnant giants that had survived the last logging cycle, their trunks 3 meters wide at the base, and going up and up into a canopy that filtered the morning light into something greenish and diffuse. It smelled like loam and cold water and the faint mineral scent of rain that had fallen sometime in the night. They went alone. She had told the column to hold, which they were not happy about, but which she had told them to do in a tone that communicated this was not a discussion. Anna moved through the brush with the easy, unassuming gait of someone who had been walking this ground for a month, who knew where the roots were and where the soft spots were in the bank. She moved behind him and kept her hand near her sidearm and watched the trees. "Don't draw it," he said without turning. "I wasn't. You were about to. I can tell by the way you're walking." He glanced back. "It will notice." They noticed body language more than sound. She moved her hand away from the holster. They reached the bottom of the ravine where a creek ran fast over smooth stones. On the far bank, in the shadow under the largest of the old-growth firs, there was something. Okafor had seen footage. Okafor had seen footage, and she had been in the field, and she had still not quite understood what she was dealing with until right now, standing still with the creek running over her boots, and the thing 20 meters away watching her with whatever sense it used for watching. It was not like anything she had a word for. It was present the way weather was present, not a thing so much as a condition of the local environment, an alteration in the quality of the air and the light and the feeling in her chest. It was dark and not dark, and it was large, and it was very, very still. Beside her, Anna was also still. She breathed once, twice. The thing on the far bank shifted, not a movement exactly, more a reorganization. Something in its posture or configuration changed, and the change carried information she couldn't decode but felt she was supposed to be decoding. "It's saying something," she said quietly. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. "Yes," Annam said. "It's been saying something for 3 weeks. I've been trying to figure out what." The analysts arrived 4 days later, which was 3 days and 23 hours after Okafor had radioed a situation report that had apparently caused 3 separate people above her pay grade to stare at a satellite phone in silence for longer than was comfortable. They came in 2 vehicles up the ridge road, and they brought equipment, and they brought Dr. Yemi Adisa, who was the closest thing Earth currently had to a first contact specialist, which meant he had spent a decade writing papers about what first contact might hypothetically look like, and was now discovering that the hypothesis had been wrong in almost every particular. Adisa was a small man with extremely precise glasses, and the manner of someone who was holding a great deal of intellectual excitement in careful check because the situation clearly did not warrant excitement. He stood on the cabin porch with a cup of tea Annam had made him and looked down the slope toward the ravine and asked in a careful voice whether the entity had made any communicative gestures. "All the time," Annam said. Adisa turned to look at him with an expression that would have been in a less controlled man shock. "And you've been responding?" "Not intentionally. I don't know enough to respond intentionally." Annam refilled his own cup. "But you're always communicating, whether you mean to or not. Body posture, movement patterns, approach and withdrawal. The decision to go down there every morning. The decision not to run. You don't want to run, Okafor said from where she was leaning against the porch rail. I've wanted to run plenty of times, he said. I just don't do it. There's a difference. Adisa had his tablet out and was pulling up contact data from the 47 other sites. The pattern there was almost uniformly the same: approach, response, escalation to violence, withdrawal, or elimination. Usually escalation had occurred within the first 72 hours. Usually it had started with something small: a person reaching for a weapon, a vehicle moving too fast, a communication system broadcasting at a frequency that had turned out to be meaningful in a way no one had anticipated. Here, 4 weeks, no violence, sustained mutual observation. What are they? Adisa asked almost to himself. I don't know, Anam said. I've been sitting with that question for a while. I don't think the question itself is right. He looked out at the trees. What are you? What am I? The categories aren't working. We need different categories. Adisa looked at him over his glasses. You studied xenobiology, xenobiological systems. Theoretical, like I said. A pause. Though I guess everything's applied now. They established a base of operations in and around the cabin. Adisa's team set up equipment, frequency analyzers, electromagnetic field monitors, a suite of cameras pointed at the ravine, and they ran their equipment, and they watched their screens, and they built models, and their models told them very little that Anam hadn't already told them from observation. The entity's communications were not acoustic. They were not electromagnetic in any band the team's equipment could consistently detect. They appeared to involve some form of spatial modulation, alterations in local field geometry that correlated with certain behaviors and certain responses that built over time into patterns which were almost but not quite regular in the way language is almost but not quite regular before you. Vive learned it. Anam went to the ravine every morning. Okafor went with him after the first week, when it became clear that her presence was tolerated. She didn't say much. She stood at the bank and watched the thing on the far bank and tried to understand what she was feeling. And what she was feeling was complicated. Grief, partly. For her 12, for all of the dead from all of the sites. Something else, though. Something she didn't have a word for immediately and had to work at. She eventually decided it was the sensation of being looked at by something that was genuinely curious about you, the way a scientist is curious, without judgment or the intent to harm. She had not felt that recently. She had not felt that in a while. On the 9th day, the entity crossed the creek. Anam did not move. Okafor did not move. She was very proud of herself for not moving. Her hand did not go to her sidearm. Her breathing stayed even. The creek was about 4 meters wide and maybe half a meter deep, and the entity crossed it in a way that didn't quite correspond to wading. It was more that it transferred itself from one bank to the other, the water moving out of the way not because of displacement, but because the space the water occupied was briefly reclassified. It stopped 2 meters from Anam. Anam looked at it. It looked at him. Then it raised one of its limb-adjacent structures and did something that was unmistakably, unambiguously, inescapably a gesture. Not a human gesture. A gesture. Something directional. Something that carried weight. Anam was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he raised his own hand. Just the right one. He held it out, palm up, the way you offer something to a stray animal that has been hurt. The entity did not touch his hand. But something happened in the air between them. A shift, a settling, a change of state that Okafor felt in her sternum and her teeth in the back of her throat. Like a pressure change before a storm, except the storm never came. Like the moment after a very long silence when both parties have said everything important without speaking. Behind them, at the cabin, every piece of Adisa's monitoring equipment spiked simultaneously and then went still. That was language, Adisa said. 15 minutes later, in a voice that was about 4 notes higher than his usual voice. Whatever just happened, that was language. That was exchange. He was pulling data on a laptop, hands moving fast. The field geometry changed. The sensor array shows a bilateral pattern, which means it said something and he said something back, Okafor said. Adisa stopped. Essentially, yes. What did they say? I have absolutely no idea, Adisa said, but they said it. Anam's mother's name had been Aisha Diallo. She had come from Bamako and had spent most of her adult life in Seattle working as a structural engineer. And she had built, among other things, 3 bridges, 1 hospital wing, and a community center in the Central District that still bore her name on a small plaque near the entrance. She had been 61 when the cancer came back the second time. She had handled it the way she had handled most things, with a particular quality of stillness that was not resignation but something more like a very deep looking, like she was studying the situation from all angles to see if there was anything in it she could use. Annam had been there at the end. He had held her hand. He had said the things you say. None of them had been wrong, exactly, but none of them had been right either, because there is no language for that moment that sits at the right angle to the thing itself. Language always comes at it oblique. His mother had known that, he thought. She had a little smile at the end that might have been for him and might have been for something else. He had never decided which. He told this to the entity on the 14th day. He didn't know why. He had been sitting on a flat rock by the creek. The entity settled on the far bank in one of its periodic still phases, and he had started talking. He did this sometimes, not because he thought it understood the words, not even because it helped him to say them, but because the quality of the silence between them was the kind of silence that wanted filling. He talked about his mother. He talked about the bridges she had built and the way she used to hum when she was calculating load distributions, a specific tuneless murmur that was actually, now that he thought about it, quite mathematically structured. He talked about the last months in the hospital and the apartment. He talked about the specific shape of the grief, not like emptiness, not like a wound, but like a field he'd been walking in his whole life and had only now looked up and noticed the edges of. The entity was very still while he talked. When he stopped, it did something new. It moved one of its structures slowly through the air in a motion that was curved, sustained. It described a shape. Then it held the shape, stationary, for nearly a minute before letting the structure settle back. He thought about the shape for a long time that night. He thought it might have been something like, "I understand," but not the way you'd say "I understand" to dismiss someone's pain. More the way you'd say "I understand" if you had actually understood. If you had taken the information in and held it somewhere, it could change things. It was possible he was projecting. He thought about that too. He thought about it all night. He thought about the ways in which humans project, the ways in which pattern recognition, that specifically human piece of wiring that had kept the species alive through every winter, every predator, every drought, also leads you to see faces in clouds and gods in weather and meaning in coincidence. He was aware that what he was doing might be that. He was aware that the grief might be doing things to his judgment. He was also aware that whatever was happening in the ravine was real, was documented, was changing the monitoring readings in ways that could not be projected into. The question was whether the meaning was in the readings or in him. He decided, somewhere around 3 in the morning, that this was a false binary. That meaning might be the thing that happens in the space between two entities that are genuinely attending to each other, not a property of one or the other. Something generated in the contact itself. He thought his mother would have had something to say about that. He could almost hear her, the particular pitch of her voice, when she was about to take apart an argument with care and precision. He almost said it out loud, to the dark, to the empty room. Instead, he lay still and listened to the mountain. The situation elsewhere was not improving. Okafor received briefings every morning from command, and the briefings were a litany of catastrophic contact events, of cities where things had gone from tense to violent in the space of hours, of military responses that had been either ineffective or had made things worse, and often both. The entities were not behaving like an invasion force in any strategic sense that human military thinking could map. They were not securing resources. They were not establishing territorial perimeters. They were not communicating demands. They appeared to be observing, probing, distributing themselves through human-populated areas in ways that correlated with density and complexity, rather than with resource location or defensible terrain. Every time humans responded with force, something happened. Not always immediate retaliation. Sometimes it was hours or days later, and sometimes it was not retaliation at all, but something more like an experiment, a test of a different variable, as if they were mapping the range of human responses in a way that was systematic and patient and entirely outside human models of how contact goes. "They're learning," Adisa said one morning, looking at the aggregate data. "So are we," Annam said from behind his coffee. "We're not learning fast enough. Nobody ever does." He set the mug down. "That's the thing about learning, right? You always feel like you're behind. Because you are. You're always behind. The question is whether you're catching up or falling further back." Adisa looked at him. "Which are we?" Annam was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. Maybe both in different places." In the ravine, he was catching up. He had started to identify recurring patterns in the entity's field geometry. Not decode them, not yet, but flag them. The way you learn to flag the structural elements of a language before you understand the grammar. There were at minimum 7 distinct pattern classes that he could identify. There were what appeared to be modifiers. There were elements that seemed to appear only in response to certain behaviors of his, and others that appeared only when it initiated. He began keeping a notebook. He had no training in linguistics. He had no training in fieldwork. He was a 26-year-old man with a grief so large he hadn't been able to get on a plane home, who had instead driven to a mountain and sat in the quiet for weeks while the world reinvented itself below. This turned out, improbably, to be an advantage. Because he was not a trained linguist, he didn't have trained linguist assumptions. Because he wasn't a soldier, he didn't have soldier assumptions. Because he was grieving, he had a particular relationship with the irreducible presence of something that couldn't be managed, only witnessed. He had spent weeks sitting with something unbearable and simply continuing to breathe. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, a very specific and transferable skill. He noted in his notebook that the entity seemed to have something analogous. Not grief exactly, the parallel couldn't hold that far, but a quality of presence, of weight, that suggested it was carrying something, that it had arrived here with something other than logistics in mind. He wrote, "They are not explorers, they are not conquerors. They are something we don't have a word for. People who have come a very long way because of something they could not stay and live with." He read this back the next morning and thought it was probably wrong. He kept it anyway. On the 22nd day, things escalated. Not in the ravine, elsewhere. A military response at one of the equatorial contact sites had apparently triggered a cascade. The entities in that region had shifted from observation to something that was being described in the briefings as aggressive spatial restructuring, which was the military's way of saying that 3 square kilometers of coastline were no longer quite in the same relationship to the rest of reality as they had been before. No casualties, but the implications were significant and the people doing the briefing were not sleeping. Adisa came to Anam at the creek that morning with the data pulled up on his tablet and said quietly, "We need to move faster." Anam was watching the entity on the far bank. Faster than what? Faster than the deterioration curve everywhere else. Adisa turned the tablet so Anam could see it. If what's happening on the equatorial sites is indicative, we have maybe 8 weeks before the situation passes any kind of recoverable threshold. Anam studied the tablet for a moment. Then he handed it back. "You're asking me to push it," he said. "I'm asking you to try to accelerate the... You're asking me to push it." He looked back at the entity. "If I push it, I might break it. This thing we're building here, I might break it. And then we'd have nothing." He turned to Adisa. "I know that's not what you want to hear." Adisa was quiet for a long time. "No," he admitted, "it's not. This can't be forced." Anam picked up a flat stone from the creek bed and turned it over in his hand. "You know what my mother said to me once? She was talking about engineering, about designing for load, and she said, the structure can only carry what it's built to carry. You can't will it to hold more than it holds. What you can do is understand it well enough to build a better structure." He set the stone down. "We're not at the building stage yet. We're at the understanding stage. You can't skip understanding." Adisa looked at him for a long moment. "You remind me," Adisa said finally, "of no one I've ever worked with. Is that good or bad? I genuinely don't know yet." The breakthrough, when it came, was quiet. It was the 31st day. Early morning, the light barely in the sky, frost on the grass and the creek running silver in the half-dark. Anam had come down earlier than usual. He hadn't slept well. The kind of not sleeping that isn't distress exactly but is alertness. The mind's insistence that something is about to happen. The entity was already at the bank. Not across the creek on its side at the bank, right at the water's edge, on his side. It had crossed in the night and was standing, if standing was the word, at the near edge of the flat rock where he usually sat. He stopped 6 feet from it. His heart was doing something unusual, but he breathed through it. It was very close. Close enough that the field effect was not just detectable as a measurement, but felt, physically, in the way you feel the pressure change when a weather system moves in. His skin prickled. The air tasted metallic and also somehow green, like ozone and pine together. He sat down on the rock. The entity lowered, settled, came to rest. It arranged itself beside him in a way that was not quite sitting, but occupied the same categorical register. Together they watched the creek. The sun came up. The light moved through the fir canopy and laid itself across the water in long, angled bars. A bird started up somewhere. The frost on the grass began to let go. They sat together in this for a long time. Then the entity did something it had never done before. It produced a sound, not a field geometry modulation, not a spatial shift. A sound. It was low and complex, with harmonics in a range that pressed on the inside of the ear rather than entering it normally. And it went on for perhaps 30 seconds, and in those 30 seconds Anam felt, not understood it, but felt the shape of something, a structure, a vastness, a loneliness so enormous it had its own gravity. When the sound stopped, the silence was different from all the silences before it. He thought of his mother. He thought of her hands. He thought of the particular way she had said his name, the weight she put on the first syllable, as if his name itself was something she had built and was proud of. He started to hum, tunelessly, at first, the way his mother used to hum when she was thinking, the unstructured murmur he had described to the entity days before. But then it shaped itself into something. He wasn't choosing it, it was choosing itself. An old song. A song from Bamako. Something his mother used to sing in the kitchen on Sunday mornings, the words of which he only partly knew and partly remembered and partly invented, because the words were less important than the shape of the sound, the way it moved in the chest, the way it was designed to be heard by someone and to tell that someone, I am here, and I remember. I am here, and the world has not taken everything. He hummed for a long time. The entity was utterly still. When he stopped, there was a long moment. Then the entity produced the sound again. Not the same sound, not a copy. Something that had the same structure, the same shape, in a register that was not acoustic but carried the same information. I am here, I remember. The world has not taken everything. Adisa's equipment, back at the cabin, produced data that his team would spend the next 3 years analyzing, arguing over, revising, and ultimately agreeing on. The unanimous conclusion, stated in the final published paper in language that was careful and qualified and fully aware of how extraordinary it was that what had happened in the ravine that morning was something that resembled, at the most fundamental informational level, the beginning of a shared language, not a transfer of data, not a decoding of symbols, a construction, in the space between two entities attending to each other, of something neither of them had brought. The days that followed were different. Not different in any dramatic way. There were no sudden breakthroughs, no information dumps, no reveal of the entity's origin or intentions, no strategic communications that could be passed up the chain of command in comprehensible form. What there was an ongoing, careful, slow accumulation of exchange. They were building vocabulary the way small children build vocabulary, through repetition, through context, through error and correction, through the patient accumulation of understood moments, until there are enough of them to start constructing something more. The entity came to the near bank every day now. Anam came every day. Okafor came when she could, and sat a little away and watched. She had stopped thinking of it in threat assessment terms, and she had not replaced that with anything and was not sure she needed to. Some things you just watch. Some things you just let happen to you. She thought about the 12. She thought about them every day. She thought about Dressler, the corporal who had come back speaking the impossible language and weeping. She hadn't seen the report on Dressler in 3 weeks. She made a note to follow up, and then didn't follow up, because she was afraid of what the answer was. One morning, about 2 weeks into the new period, the entity brought something. It was not a physical object exactly, but it occupied space in the way objects do, and it was clearly intentional, and clearly being offered. It was small and it was complex, and it registered on Adisa's equipment as a self-contained field geometry, stable, intricate, not like anything in the contact data from any other site. Anam looked at it for a long time. Then he went into the cabin and came back with his notebook. He sat down at the creek bank and opened the notebook to a page in the middle and showed it to the entity. Not a physical object either in the relevant sense, not something the entity could read. But it was something Anam had made that was complex and intentional, and the act of showing it was itself a communication. Here is something I made because of you. Here is what you look like from inside my way of thinking. The entity examined the notebook with something Anam had learned to read as extended attention. Then it put the thing it had brought, the offered object, near the notebook, not touching it, near it. He thought about this for a long time. He wrote in the notebook, I think they came here because something happened. Not invasion, migration. The word doesn't fit either, but it's closer. They are not here to take. They are here because where they came from is somewhere they could no longer be. 6 weeks in, Narayanan published a revised taxonomy of pattern classes that ran to 80 pages and that Anam read twice in a single night. sitting at the table in the cabin with a cooling cup of coffee, and the particular focused quiet he had developed over weeks of listening in the ravine. It was good work. It was careful, rigorous, methodologically impeccable. It described, in precise academic language, the structures they had been building. He thought it was missing something. He thought about it for a day before he could articulate what. Then he sat down across from Narayanan with the printed document and a pen and said, as diplomatically as he could manage, "This is excellent. I want to push back on one thing." She raised her eyebrows. "The taxonomy implies the patterns are fixed units," he said, "like vocabulary items that exist independently of context. But they're not. They change depending on what came before them in the exchange. The same pattern in a different position means something different. The position is the meaning, more than the pattern itself." He opened the document to a middle page. "Here, where you've classified this as pattern class 4, in isolation, yes. But in the exchanges where I've seen it, it's always preceded by one of 3 specific other patterns, and the meaning shifts radically based on which one. Without the preceding context, you've got the word but not the sentence." Narayanan looked at where he was pointing. She was quiet for a long time. "That's a syntax," she said finally. "Yes, it has syntax, yes. Except it's a syntax that's contextual rather than rule-based. The context is the rule. The history of the exchange is the grammar." She took the document back and sat with it for a while, reading. He went and made 2 cups of coffee and brought one to her. She didn't look up. He stood at the window and looked at the slope. "We need to rebuild the entire taxonomy," she said, without looking up. "I know. That's 4 months of work. I know. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," she said, and now she did look up, and there was something in her face that was exasperated and illuminated at the same time. The expression of a person who has had the rug pulled out from under a large structure and found, underneath, something more interesting than the rug. This is what science is supposed to do. Find the thing you missed and do it again, better. She made a note in the margins. "Also, I'd been suspicious of the fixity assumption since week 2. You just gave me the data I needed to formalize the doubt." She went back to the document. He drank his coffee at the window and watched the slope and thought about his mother, who had said something similar once about a structural calculation she'd gotten wrong on a minor project early in her career. Not wrong in the sense of dangerous, but wrong in the sense of under-optimized. A beam that could have been lighter and still held. She had gone back and recalculated and rebuilt the model, and from then on had not made that particular class of error again. She had described the experience not as failure, but as the specific relief of finding out that reality was more interesting than your model of it. He had not understood what she meant at the time. He understood it now. The nights were cold on the mountain, deep into autumn, and the cabin had a wood stove that was efficient, if not beautiful, and a system of settling sounds that had become as familiar to Anam as his own breathing. He had come here in early September, which meant he was now well into his 2nd month, and the light was different, shorter, lower angled. The quality of illumination in the ravine shifted from the green gold of late summer to something clearer and more slant, more northern. He had been thinking about the entity's biology, not in a clinical way. He did not have the training for clinical thinking on this, and Adisa's team covered that dimension competently. He had been thinking about it in a more lived way, the way you think about another person's experience when you're spending a lot of time in proximity to them. What was the cold to it? What was the season? Did its sense of time track with anything like what he experienced? He had no way to ask this directly yet, but he noticed that its behavior shifted in the cold mornings, that there was a quality of the field around it that he associated with something like warmth-seeking, the subtle reorganization of its surface that his notebook had started calling the morning adjustment. He had started arriving earlier than the entity, which was a decision he hadn't made consciously, but had noticed making. He wanted to be there already when it arrived. He wanted the exchange to start with him in place, available, not still approaching. It was a small thing. He thought it might matter. On a Tuesday in mid-October, he arrived at the rock to find it not empty but occupied. A flat stone that had not been there before, positioned at the edge of the creek on the far bank, at the spot where the entity most often settled. It was not a large stone. It was smooth and gray and river-worn, and it sat at an angle that was not quite natural. Positioned, deliberate. He looked at it for a long time. He went back to the cabin and got his notebook, and came back and sat on his rock and looked at the stone on the other bank and wrote, "It put something here. Not in exchange, not as offering, not as communication in the normal sense. It put something here so that when it arrived there would be something at the spot where it sits. The same way I arrive early. The same logic. It is preparing the space. It is treating this place as a place that deserves preparation, as a place that is more than a location, as somewhere. He underlined the last word. He sat and watched the stone until the entity arrived, which was about 40 minutes later, and it settled at the far bank near the place stone. And it was a long time before he could be sure what he was feeling. And what he was eventually sure he was feeling was something for which he did not have an elegant word, only a long description. The sensation of discovering that the thing you have been doing has been reciprocal. That you have not been building alone. He did not write this in the notebook that day. He just sat with it. Some things are better not written down immediately. Some things need to stay in the body for a while before they become language. The equatorial situation reached its crisis point on day 43. The briefing that morning was delivered by a general who had not slept in several days and who had the controlled, flat voice of a person who is describing a catastrophe and has decided that the most useful thing they can do with their body is keep it from shaking. The entities at 5 equatorial sites had, coordinated was not quite the right word, but the timing had been within a 15-minute window, initiated what was being described as a demonstration, not an attack. The damage had been to uninhabited infrastructure. It was interpreted by the analysts as a response to the military escalation of the previous week. A message. The message had not been decoded. Adisa took the briefing in silence. After the general signed off, he sat for a long time at the table. "They're trying to tell us something," he said. "They're trying to tell us a lot of things," Anam said. "We can hear about 2% of it. 2% is better than 0. It won't stay at 2%. He closed his notebook. "But we can't rush it." "Anam." Adisa leaned forward. 8 weeks. Maybe 6 now. If we don't get something transmissible up the chain, something they can act on, something that changes the response. Calculus out there. "I know," Anam said. "Then we need." "I know," he said again, quietly. "I know what we need." He was looking out the window at the slope. "I need you to understand that I can't give you a timetable. I can't guarantee a result. I can only keep going down there every morning." He turned to face Adisa. "Can you hold the chain of command for me? Can you give me the space to do this right?" Adisa looked at him for a long moment. "I'll hold them," he said, "for as long as I can." It was on day 51 that Anam asked the entity directly about the others. Not in language. He didn't have enough language for that yet. Not in the sense of symbolic exchange. But he had learned that the entity could follow intentional gesture, that certain combinations of posture and movement, and the field geometry he was beginning to learn to produce in small ways. A kind of very basic infant's handful of words could carry directional meaning. He gestured outward, away from the ravine, toward the world. He let his body carry the question. What happened out there? What is happening? What do you want? The entity was still for a very long time. Then it did something Anam hadn't seen before. It extended multiple structures simultaneously, in different directions, each one describing a different shape. Not threatening, the angle and the movement quality were wrong for threat. More like showing him many things at once. He watched carefully. Some of the shapes were things he recognized from their shared vocabulary. Some were new. He thought about it for the rest of the day. He thought about it through the night. He woke at 3 in the morning with the shape of it in his mind and reached for the notebook. He wrote, "They are not one thing. They are many things that are related the way individuals are related. They have something like internal conflict. Some of them came here to understand. Some of them came here for a reason I don't have a word for yet. Some of them are afraid, or the analog of afraid. Some of them are angry, or the analog of angry. And there are those out there who look at us and see exactly what we look like when we look at them and react accordingly. The bad contact events, those aren't policy. They're individuals acting from the analog of fear." He underlined the last word. He wrote, "They need a translator. They needed one from the start. They just didn't have a way to ask for one." He presented this to Adisa and Okafor the next morning. Okafor was quiet through the whole presentation. When he finished, she said, "You're telling me that the things that killed my people were scared." He said, "I'm telling you that some of them were, or something functionally identical to scared. I'm not saying that excuses it. I'm saying it explains it." Okafor looked at the table for a long time. "Dressler," she said finally, "the corporal. The one who walked into the perimeter and came back speaking. I haven't followed up on where he is. I know. I should follow up. You should. She looked up. What do you need from me? He had thought about this. I need you to stop the escalation at the equatorial sites. At least 2 of them. I need a stand down that holds long enough for whatever I'm learning here to propagate to those sites. I need to be able to tell my entity that we can control ourselves. That we have people out there who can hold still long enough to listen. Okafor looked at Adissa. Adissa looked at Annam. That's a request to override active military command at 2 separate locations, Okafor said. Yes. Based on your reading of an entity you've been sitting with for 51 days. Yes. She looked at the window, the slope, the tree line. Give me 12 hours, she said. She got it in 9. Okafor had things in her history that Annam didn't know about and didn't need to. Contacts, credibility, debts owed in various directions, and she was, when she chose to be, a person who moved through institutional structures with a specific and economic precision. The stand down at sites 17 and 23 came through 9 hours after she made her call. It held for 6 hours, then 12, then 36. In those 36 hours in the briefings that came through, something shifted. Not dramatic, nothing changed overnight, but the field readings at both sites showed the same bilateral pattern spikes that Adissa's equipment had recorded here. The entities at both sites appeared to register the stand down, to respond to it, not with reciprocal withdrawal, with something more like heightened attention, the quality Annam had learned to read as extended attention here, active listening. It's working, Adissa said, looking at the data at 4 in the morning, in a voice he was clearly trying to keep level. It's a start, Annam said. It's working. Annam picked up the mug and drank from it. Cold coffee. He'd forgotten to drink it before it cooled. He made a face. The hard part, he said, is going to be convincing the chain of command that the way forward is patience. He set the mug down. That's not a word they have a lot of institutional relationship with. No, said Adissa, but they have a relationship with results. Then we need to give them results. You have an idea. I have a direction. He looked at the window, the dark beyond it, the slope he could hear even if he couldn't see. I want to ask it about the others, the ones at the other sites. I want to know if it can, not talk to them. I don't think it works that way. But if it understands what's happening at the other sites, if the information I'm building here can travel back to them somehow. Adissa was quiet. You're asking if it can translate for us, to its own kind. I'm asking if this is a 2-way channel. If what we're building here is useful to them as well as to us. And if the answer is yes, then we have something. Annam was quiet for a moment. My mother built bridges. She said the thing about a bridge is it doesn't belong to either side. It lives in the space between. It's only useful if both sides can use it. Adissa looked at him. I keep thinking, Adissa said slowly, that you're doing something much harder than you're making it look. I'm not making it look like anything. I know, that's what I mean. There was another thing that Okafor had done, that she had not reported up the chain and that Annam would not learn about until much later. On the night before the stand down went into effect at Site 17, she had placed a call to the site commander, a colonel named Hutchins, who had been in the field for 3 straight weeks, and who was operating on no sleep and a belief system that held, with some supporting evidence, that force was the only language these entities understood. She had not given him orders. She did not have the authority to give him orders. What she had done was talk to him for 40 minutes in the middle of the night about what she had seen in the ravine, in a voice stripped of all the formality and institutional framing. Just one person telling another person what she had witnessed. The stone placed on the bank. The entity sitting with Annam through the cold mornings. The sound in the ravine that Adissa's equipment had recorded, and nobody had yet adequately explained. Hutchins had listened. He had not said much. He had hung up and in the morning had told his team to hold position and maintain non-engagement protocols, and had held that order through the entire stand-down period and beyond. She never knew if it was her call that changed his mind or something else. She never asked. It didn't matter in the end. What mattered was that he had held. She thought sometimes in the years that followed about what it meant to change someone's mind, not through argument or authority or force, but through the older and more uncertain method, telling them what you had seen, honestly, without the protective mediation of institutional language, and trusting that it landed somewhere. It usually didn't. The odds were bad. But sometimes it did, and when it did, it was the realest thing there was. Because it moved through the gap between one consciousness and another, by the same mechanism that Annam and the entity were using in the ravine, the willingness to be genuinely present with something, the attention that does not manage or control but simply witnesses and transmits. She was never a mystic about it. She was, if anything, more of a hard-nosed pragmatist than she had been before the mountain. But she held, as a private and unbriefable conviction, that the most important thing any of them had done in this entire sequence of events was not a military action, not a scientific discovery, not a policy decision. It was a person with no qualifications and no official role sitting down on a flat rock by a creek and deciding, for reasons he himself could not fully articulate, not to run. Day 57. He had been sitting with the question for 6 days. How to ask it. What language they had between them that could carry something this complex. He had been adding to the shared vocabulary, not rushing it, still not rushing it, but intentionally extending it in the direction he needed. He had learned that there was a pattern class that seemed to correspond to information traveling in a direction, outward, transmitted. He had learned that there was a modifier that suggested multiplicity, manyness. He had learned that there was something he thought of, in his notebook, as the relating pattern, the one that appeared when the entity seemed to be describing a relationship between things rather than a thing itself. He built the question slowly in the vocabulary they shared over the course of an hour. He built it the way his mother built a load calculation, methodically, checking each element, making sure nothing was carrying more than it could hold. When he put the question, the entity's response was immediate. It was the largest, most complex thing it had ever produced in their exchanges. Patterns layering on patterns, the field geometry around them shifting through configurations that Adisa's equipment would later take months to map. It lasted for nearly 10 minutes. At the end, Anam was very still. He sat that way for a long time. Then he picked up the notebook and he wrote, quickly without stopping because he was afraid of losing it. He wrote, "Yes. Yes, they know. They have been watching us the same way I have been watching them, the same way it has been watching me. They have been trying to understand us, and mostly getting it wrong, and mostly getting it wrong. The same way we get each other wrong, which is to say not maliciously but with fear and with pattern recognition firing at the wrong targets. They have something that looks like disagreement about whether to be here at all. They have something that looks like urgency that I don't understand yet. They did not come here to conquer or to explore. They came here because they are crossing something. Not a space, a state, some transition that I don't have the concepts for. And contact with us is not necessary but meaningful. Not necessary but meaningful. Like when you're very far from home and you find someone who knows the same language and you talk for a while and it doesn't fix anything but it changes the quality of the going on. He set down the pen and looked at what he had written. He thought, I don't know if this is right. He thought, it's as right as I can get it right now. He thought, that has to be enough. The communication he drafted for Adisa to send up the chain of command took 3 days to write. He went through 23 drafts. Okafor helped with the parts that needed to translate into military and strategic framing, which was a different language from any other, and had its own specific requirements and its own specific pitfalls. Adisa helped with the scientific framing, the qualification language, the careful construction of a case that didn't claim more than it could support. What it said, in essence, was this. First contact had not failed. It had been failing in a specific and addressable way. The entities were individuals, not a unified force. They were experiencing something like the range of responses that any population experiences when encountering the unknown, which meant that some of them could, with patience and the right conditions, be engaged. That engagement was not strategic in the conventional sense. It would not yield decoded transmissions or negotiated ceasefires in the near term. What it would yield was what all genuine understanding yields: a slightly better chance of not destroying each other out of fear. The recommendation was for a network of what the document called contact mediators, people, plural, positioned at multiple sites, who could begin to build the same kind of slow vocabulary that had developed in the ravine. Not soldiers, not diplomats, people who could hold still. People who had a relationship with the unknown that was not purely threat response. People who had, in the precise formulation Anam used in Draft 7 and kept in all subsequent drafts, already learned to sit with something unbearable and simply continue to breathe. They would need training. They would need time. They would need protection from institutional pressure to produce results faster than results could be produced. The document went up the chain. It came back with questions. It went back up. Okafor tracked down Corporal Dressler on day 63. She found him at a rehabilitation facility in Tacoma, which was what they were calling the buildings where people were recovering from close proximity contact events. He was on the mend physically, cognitively he was. The staff described it as reorganization. He was doing well in tests of the new linguistic structures he'd apparently been rewired for. Less well in tests of some of the old ones. He was having to rebuild certain things from scratch. She sat with him for an hour. He couldn't explain what had happened to him at the perimeter. He didn't remember most of it. What he remembered was being inside something, not attacked, not dissected, not violated, though those were the words the initial reports had used. Inside something, the way you're inside a building, surrounded by it, and a kind of pressure in his mind that was not pain but was also not comfortable. The way learning always has some discomfort in it, and then a kind of, he searched for the word for a while and then said slowly, opening, like a door he hadn't known was there. Okafor had not cried in public since she was 11 years old. She did not cry now. She thanked him and drove back to the mountain. In 3 hours of highway through the dark and parked outside the cabin and sat in the vehicle for a while. Then she went inside, sat at the table and put her head down and made a sound that was quite crying and was not quite not. Anam brought her tea. He didn't say anything. He sat down across from her and drank his own tea and let her do what she needed to do. After a while she lifted her head. It's such a mess, she said. Yes. So many people. Yes. She looked at her hands. Is it going to get better? He was quiet for a moment. Better is a long road, he said. I think it's a road we can walk. I think we've found the on-ramp. But no, I don't know if it's going to get better. I don't know what better looks like from here. He paused. I know it's not going to be simple. I know it's going to take longer than anyone wants it to take. I know there are going to be more bad days. Another pause. But I think that's the thing about the on-ramp. Once you're on it, you're going somewhere. Even if somewhere takes a while. Okafor drank her tea. Outside, the mountain was quiet. The creek ran in the dark, continuous and unhurried. On day 70, the entity brought a third thing. The first thing it had brought, weeks ago, was the offered object, the self-contained field geometry, complex and intentional. The second thing had been something more ambiguous, a kind of extended communication about the nature of its kind that Anam was still unpacking. The third thing was something he didn't have a frame for. It was not an object. It was not a communication in the vocabulary they shared. It was a change in the quality of the space around the creek, a sustained alteration, and within that alteration there was something that was very clearly being shown to him. Not told. Shown. He stood at the bank and looked at it for a long time. What he saw, or what he apprehended, since seeing wasn't quite the right word, was something vast. Vast in a way that had nothing to do with size, a sense of a long, long journey, and not a journey through space, and not a journey that was over, and something at the end of it, or not at the end, in the middle, here, now, that the entity was trying to show him could be this. Two entities at a creek bank, in the early light, with their different biologies and their different minds and their different ways of carrying the fact of existence, constructing in the space between them something that neither had arrived with. He stood at the bank for a long time. He thought about his mother's bridges. He thought about her hands doing the calculations, the smooth, worn surface of her drafting pencil, the way she would stop mid-hum and mark a number and continue humming without breaking stride. He thought about the hospital and the last room and the quality of light in that room, the particular Seattle gray of a November afternoon coming through the blinds, and his mother's hand in his hand, and the specific rightness of holding on. He sat down on the flat rock. The entity settled beside him. The morning came in over the ridge, the way it always did, slow and golden. After a while, he started to hum. In the weeks that followed the first breakthrough, the cabin became something that had no official designation and that everybody nonetheless understood. Adisa's team had expanded from the original 2 vehicles to a compound that included 3 modular units, a satellite uplink, a small generator array, and a rotating staff of 12 whose job titles ranged from atmospheric physicist to cultural anthropologist to, in one case that Anam found quietly delightful, something called an interstitial communication theorist, which was a role that had been invented specifically for this situation. The interstitial communication theorist was a woman named Dr. Priya Narayanan, and she was the most methodical human being Anam had ever encountered. She approached the contact data with a focus that was almost physical in its intensity, working 16-hour days to build models of the pattern classes he had identified, running comparison algorithms against every known linguistic and mathematical structure, and coming away from each comparison with the same conclusion. It was not like anything. It was not a cipher of a known system. It was not, as some early models had suggested, a mathematical universal. It was more particular than that, more contextual, more dependent on the specific relational history between the two parties rather than on any fixed lexical structure. It's not a language, she told him one evening, looking at 3 weeks of pattern data spread across 6 monitors. It's not any kind of language. It's more like, do you know how infants first learn to communicate? Before words, before syntax. There's this period where communication is entirely about joint attention. Both parties attending to the same thing, together, and the attending itself being the message. Annam thought about this. Except we're not attending to the same things, he said. We come from completely different everything. We don't have shared reference. Right. So the question is, what do you share? She turned to look at him. And the answer, apparently, is the fact of attending itself. You're both curious. You're both watching. You're both present. That's the shared referent. Everything else is being built on top of that. She turned back to her screens. It's remarkable. I've been in this field for 20 years, and I didn't think this was possible. I thought you needed at least something to bootstrap from, some piece of shared experience, mathematics, physical constants, something. We had something, Annam said. She looked at him. We both had the experience of being very far from home, he said, and finding something we didn't understand and choosing to stay with it anyway. She considered this for a long time. That's not something I can put in a model, she finally said. No, he agreed. But I think it might be the model. She gave him a look that was skeptical and not skeptical at the same time. The look of a scientist hearing something that can't be formalized and, knowing it might be true anyway, she put it in her notes as a hypothesis, provisional, to be returned to. Okafor ran security with a restraint that cost her something. She was aware of the cost. She kept an accounting of it the way she kept most things, internally, without drama, with the particular discipline of someone who has learned that feelings do not stop being real if you do not express them. They simply accrue interest. She had 12 dead. She had the briefings every morning with their litany of new dead at other sites. She had a situation in which the right response, the useful response, the response that might actually help, was to stand very still and wait. She was good at standing still. She had been trained to hold positions. But this was different from holding a position. Holding a position meant the danger was outside you, and you were keeping it out. This was something more like accepting that the danger was real and proximate, and choosing not to respond to it in the ways her training said to. Respond because the training was wrong for this. Because the training had been built for a world where the right move was always some form of force, some form of assertion, some form of making yourself larger and your opponent smaller. Out here, the right move was smaller. The right move was to take up less space and make less noise and let something happen at its own pace. This was, she had decided, the hardest thing she had ever done. And she had done some hard things. She thought sometimes about the chain of command, about the people above her who were operating on the old logic, the force and response logic, and getting results that looked like results on a briefing slide, but were not what she was seeing here. She thought about how to explain what she was seeing. She thought about the gap between what could be explained in a briefing and what was actually happening, the vast unmappable territory between those two things, and how that gap was itself part of the problem. She kept doing her job. She set up the perimeter in a way that was protective rather than aggressive, a distinction that sounded semantic until you actually had to operationalize it, at which point it turned out to require a total redesign of protocol, rules of engagement, positioning, everything. She worked with her team on this and got a lot of pushback and stood her ground and eventually made it work. She had a conversation one night with Vasquez, the 19-year-old point man who had been there at the beginning, who had been with her for 4 months now, and had aged several years in that time, in the specific way that combat ages you, and then the long stillness of post-combat ages you differently in the places combat can't reach. You ever think about quitting, he asked. Every day, she said. Why don't you? She looked at the monitors, the screens showing the ravine, the creek, the dark under the trees. Because somebody has to hold the line, she said, and holding this particular line looks like not shooting. She paused, and I'm good at it, even though it's the hardest thing, because all the things that make me good at the other kind of holding, the patience, the watching, The ability to stay present when everything in you wants to move. They all apply. They just apply in the opposite direction. Vasquez thought about this. My grandmother, he said finally, used to say that courage is what you use when you're afraid. But she also said there's another word. She used a word in Spanish I don't have an English equivalent for. That's what you use when you already know the outcome and the outcome is terrible and you do it anyway. Not because you're brave, because you've accepted the terms. What's the word? He thought about it. Entrega, he said. Sort of. It means surrender, but the kind you choose, not defeat. Something more like giving yourself to the thing. Okafor sat with that. Yeah, she said after a while, that's the one. Adisa published a preliminary paper at the 4-month mark. He did not do this lightly. The decision involved several lengthy conversations, numerous revisions, and one very tense call with an institutional review board that was trying to apply frameworks designed for a world in which the primary ethical concern in research was the welfare of the human subjects. The paper was short. It was careful. It made no claims it could not support, and was explicit about everything it could not support, which was most things. What it said, in its careful and qualified language, was that at one site of extended civilian entity contact, bilateral communication development had been observed. That the development was not linguistic in any conventional sense but was structured, was mutually generated, was demonstrably building over time, that the conditions correlated with lack of aggressive incident. That more research was needed. The response to the paper was difficult to characterize. In the scientific community, it produced a wave of cautious excitement, the kind that in most fields would be called moderate interest, but that in this specific moment registered as barely controlled collective hyperventilation, given that everyone in every field touching on contact phenomena had been waiting for exactly this kind of documented, methodologically defensible data point. In the policy world, it produced a different wave, which was harder to read. Adisa read the responses from officials and advisors and tried to translate them and came back to Annam with his findings. They want to know if we can weaponize it, Adisa said, and then immediately added, I know. I'm just telling you what they asked. What did you tell them? I told them the question was not applicable to the phenomenon as understood. That's a very diplomatic way of saying no. I've been working on my diplomacy. Annam looked out the window. It had been raining for 3 days. The creek would be running fast. What they want, he said slowly, is a lever. Something they can operate on the situation from the outside, with force if needed. And what we're finding is that the situation has no outside. There's no place to stand that isn't inside it. You can't lever a thing you're part of. He paused, which means the only tool is the one nobody wants to use. Patience, Adisa said. Presence. Being here, actually attending, actually building, without knowing what you're building toward. He turned from the window. That's the thing. Nobody knows where this goes. I don't know where it goes. And the whole institutional mind, the whole apparatus, is designed to manage uncertainty by eliminating it, by pushing until things become clear, by forcing resolution. He shook his head. You can't force this. You can only be with it. Adisa was quiet for a moment. For someone who came here to be alone with his grief, he said, you've become remarkably good at explaining things to committees. Annam looked at him. My mother, he said, had a saying. She said the dead teach us things the living are too busy to say. I think about that a lot. He picked up his coat and went out into the rain toward the ravine. The entity did not come every day. This was important to note because the logs, in their inevitable tidying of the record, would later make it seem more regular than it was. There were days, several days together, sometimes, when the ravine was quiet and the creek ran through empty banks and Annam sat with his notebook and the absence of the thing, and did not know if the absence was deliberate or circumstantial, or something that didn't map to either category. He sat with not knowing. He wrote in his notebook about not knowing. He wrote, there is a specific quality to waiting for something when you don't know if it's coming, different from waiting for something you're certain will arrive, different from giving up. It's suspension. You're holding yourself in a state between here and there, between this and what comes next, and the holding itself takes all of you. You can't do much else. You can't think about the future or the past with any real traction. You just exist in this moment, which is a moment that hasn't resolved yet, which might not resolve today, which might not resolve at all. He read this back and thought, this is also a description of grief. He had been thinking that more often, the parallels between what he was doing in the ravine and what he had been doing since his mother died. The quality of presence required, the willingness to stay in the unresolved moment, the specific resistance to the human instinct, to make it mean something, to make it go somewhere, to wrap it up and put it somewhere you could move on from. His mother's death did not want to be wrapped up. The contact did not want to be wrapped up. They were both things that required him to remain in the difficulty of them rather than achieve resolution. He thought, maybe that's what I'm doing here. Not as a metaphor for grief. The contact isn't about grief. But the skills are the same. The particular kind of endurance is the same. You learn it in one place and carry it somewhere else. You don't choose what you learn it from. You just carry it. On the 12th day of the entity's absence, it came back. It came back in a way that was different, more direct, less gradual than the approach pattern he had come to expect. It was at the creek bank when he arrived, already there, in the gray pre-dawn before the sun was fully up, and it was agitated. He had a framework now for what that meant in its terms. Not the way a human is agitated, not the elevated heart rate and the restless movement and the quick speech. More equality of density, the field around it more complex and rapid than usual, patterns cycling through faster than he could track. He sat down. He waited. The agitation continued for a while. He breathed through it. He didn't try to mirror it or respond to it or resolve it. He just sat with it. The way you sit with someone who is in distress when there is nothing you can do yet. When the most useful thing is to simply be present. After about 20 minutes, the cycling slowed. After 40, it stilled. He wrote in his notebook, I don't know what happened to it during those 12 days. I don't know what it was carrying when it came back, but I think sitting with it while it was carrying it, not trying to fix it, not trying to decode it, just being there, was something. I think it registered. I think that's the oldest and simplest thing there is. I can tell you had a hard time. I'm still here. That's all I've got. Sometimes that's enough. 3 months later, Anam Diallo was in a windowless conference room in a government building in Washington, D.C., explaining to 14 people why the process was going to take as long as it was going to take. He had done this several times now, to several rooms full of several people, and he had gotten better at it. He had gotten better at reading the specific flavor of impatience that the institutional mind produces when confronted with timeframes it cannot control, and at not letting that impatience change his description of the truth. The sites where we have had established contact mediators in place for more than 3 weeks are all showing bilateral pattern development, he said. Site 7, Site 12, Site 29. At each of these sites we have recorded 0 aggressive incidents since mediation began, compared to a combined previous rate of. He glanced at the briefing packet, 43 incidents in the preceding 3-week period. He paused and looked at the room. What I need you to understand, he said, is that what we're doing is not negotiation. We are not trading concessions. We are not decoding enemy intelligence. We are building slowly the conditions under which communication becomes possible. You cannot accelerate this process any more than you can accelerate the growth of a tree by pulling on it. He paused. What you can do is protect the conditions. Don't let the military escalation resume at sites where it's been stood down. Give the mediators institutional cover. Don't demand quarterly reports in formats designed for processes this bears no resemblance to. A man at the far end of the table, older, decorated, the body language of command, said, "What's the end state?" Anam considered this. "I don't know," he said. "I don't know what contact looks like on the other side of this. I don't know what a world looks like where we're in functional communication with an entity type that operates on different informational principles than we do." He looked at his hands. "I know what a world looks like where we give up on that and go back to reacting from fear. I know what that costs." He looked up. "I think you know too." The room was quiet. The man at the end of the table looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up and said, "All right, what do you need?" Okafor took command of the contact security program 6 months after that. Dressler came to work for her. His language reconstruction was mostly complete. He had a slightly different relationship to certain words now. He would pause mid-sentence. Sometimes, the way a person pauses when they've found a translation that works, but is aware that something has been lost in the getting there. He was a careful thinker and a good observer, and he handled the strange with a particular equanimity that the staff found contagious. He and Okafor sometimes sat together in the evenings at whichever site they were working. Not talking much, watching the field monitors, the quiet of the specific and ongoing negotiation with the unknown. She asked him once what it had been like, inside the perimeter. He thought about it for a while. Like being shown a word, he said, that you didn't have before, and then having to figure out what it means. And then figuring out that you need about 5,000 more words before you can understand what it means. He paused, which would be overwhelming, except it wasn't, because somewhere in there, inside all that, there was something that felt. He stopped searching. Like recognition, he said finally. Like they had been waiting for someone to just be in the room with them. Just be in the room and not run. Okafor thought about Anam on a porch with a cup of steam rising from it and the valley below filling with the first light. Yeah, she said, I know what that looks like. Anam went back to the cabin 18 months after the initial contact. He drove up the ridge road alone. In the early morning, before the light was fully in, the cabin was the same. The mountain was the same. The creek in the ravine was the same creek, running the same stones. He sat on the flat rock at the bank for a long time. The entity was not there. He had expected that. The contact sites were elsewhere now, distributed, managed, staffed by 100 people who had been through the program he had helped design and who brought their various kinds of understanding and patience and willingness to sit with the unknown. But the rock was there. The water was there. The light came through the canopy the same way it had always come. He took out his notebook. He read back through it, from the beginning, from the early entries before he had any vocabulary, when everything was observation and question marks and the occasional frustrated line, I don't know what I'm doing, followed always by, going back tomorrow. He got to the entry from day 57. I don't know if this is right. It's as right as I can get it right now. That has to be enough. He got to the entry about the place stone. He read it twice. He had not noticed, until reading it now, that he had not written about what it felt like at the time. He had written the observation and the interpretation and left the feeling off the page, which was, he supposed, what he had been doing for most of his life, attending to the world carefully and keeping the most important things somewhere below language, in the part of you that has no words for things because the words would reduce them. His mother had been the same way. She had been precise about structure and load and the behavior of materials under stress, and she had been a person of deep emotional intelligence, and these two things had never interfered with each other in her. She had simply had different tools for different tasks, and she had known which tool was which. He thought he was only beginning to understand that. The notebook in his hands was full of observations and theories and vocabulary lists and question marks, and the occasional sentence that had managed to get out of the analytical register and say something closer to true. He had been surprised, rereading it, by how much of the real thing had escaped onto the page despite his best efforts to be a scientist about all of this. The sentence about his mother's bridges, the one about sitting with something unbearable and simply continuing to breathe, the line about building something that neither party had arrived with. Those lines were not in the taxonomy. They were not in the models. They were not in the 14 published papers that the contact work had so far generated, or the 3 that were under review, or the 7 that were in preparation. They were not transmissible in the form that institutions could use, but they were the thing. He was increasingly sure they were the thing. He thought about the 100 people now doing this work. He thought about what he hoped for them. Not results, not breakthroughs, not the vindication of any model. He hoped for them the specific experience of sitting beside something incomprehensible in the early light, not knowing, not managing, not producing, just being present with the fact of it. The experience of attending that is its own form of contact regardless of what it yields. He thought his mother would have called this prayer, or near enough. He turned to a blank page near the back. He wrote, 18 months. The work is still going. Slow. There are bad days. There will be more bad days. But the channel is open. The channel is open and people are building on both sides. And even when it doesn't feel like it, even when it feels like it's all going backward, the channel is open. He stopped. He thought about his mother. He thought about her in a way he hadn't been able to think about her for a long time. Not with the weight of the loss, not with the specific gravity of what was absent, but with something simpler. Just her. Just the specific, irreducible fact of who she had been. The bridges, the hum, the pencil, the hand. He thought she would have had something to say about all of this. He sat with that for a while. The creek went over its stones. A bird started up somewhere above. Then he wrote in the notebook in the last line he would write on that page, I am here, I remember. The world has not taken everything. He closed the notebook. He sat by the creek for a long time in the morning light and was still and listened and breathed. And somewhere in the network of sites across the world, in the slow and patient work of people learning to hold still in the presence of the unknown, in the careful construction of vocabularies between minds that had arrived with nothing in common and were slowly, carefully, without guarantees, building something anyway, somewhere in all of that, something like an answer was still being built. Not finished, not simple, but real, the way only built things are real. Because it had taken work, and time, and the willingness to fail and continue, and hands, whatever hands you have, reaching across water.